Assalamu alaikum. Good evening from Lahore. This is Nida Sheikh, Senior Officer at Center for Critical Peace Studies, and also your moderator taking you through this session. On behalf of Center for Critical Peace Studies, I welcome you all to the third session of Dialogues on Epistemic Justice. Today's topic is a subaltern gaze on white ignorance and insecurity. As a guest speaker, we have Dr. Fatima Sajjad, Director, Center for Critical Peace Studies, Associate Professor at University of Management and Technology. She's a researcher in the field of critical peace studies and peace education. More specifically, her research interests lie in empowering voices of the Global South and decolonial thinking. We are thankful to Professor Syed Farid Alatas to join this session as a discussant from National University of Singapore. Let me briefly introduce you to our panelists. We have former Professor Siri Gamage from University of New England, Professor Aaron Casanova from University of, Professor Aaron Casanova from University of Cincinnati, Ms. Carolyn Shuaif from Hong Kong Baptist University, USA, and Mr. Bari Kansever from Middle East Technical University, Ankara. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Fatima Sajjad to formally begin today's session.
Okay, thank you so much, Nida. Thank you for the introduction. Professor Erin Casanova could not join us today. She's going to join the next session. Can everyone hear me all right? We are having this azan in the background. Maybe we can wait.
Yes, ma'am, your voice is audible.
Okay, fine. Okay, then maybe
there are no background distractions.
All right. Okay, is the screen visible to everyone?
Yes, it's visible.
All right, so the paper I'm going to present today, the title is A Subaltern Gaze on White Ignorance and Insecurity. And it also has a subtitle, The Possibility of Educating Their White Rescue Plans. So I begin with a question posed by Linda T. Smith. What happens when the researched become the researchers? So this paper is a subaltern's attempt to undo the dominant white male perspective on security by describing what can be seen from the location of the researched. So let me discuss something about being a problem. Du Bois, in his celebrated work, The Souls of Black Folk, articulates a question that persists between him and the other world. How does it feel to be a problem? The question characterizes the lingering white gaze on Black bodies. I'm from Pakistan, a place described as the eye of the storm by the white security analysts after 9/11. Rydell describes the country in the following words. Pakistan is the most dangerous country in the world today. All of the nightmares of the 21st century come together in Pakistan. Nuclear proliferation, drug smuggling, military dictatorship, and above all, international terrorism. So it's considered, it is described as the most dangerous place in the world. I can relate to Du Bois' awareness and sense the heat of the question, how does it feel to be a problem? And I try to answer this question here. What I do is I look around, I see the other world, the white world termed as the international, and I describe what I see. From the place called the most dangerous in the world, I gaze back. So I begin to record my account from 9/11/2001, the day two planes demolished two towers and ruined the world's security. Owing to time limitation, I shall not be able to discuss 8/6 and 8/9/1945, the days when the two planes demolished two cities to ensure world security. Security is a treacherous word, and being a security problem is an idea worth exploring. So I first examined how, following 9/11, the presumed ignorance and lack of education of certain groups of people was constructed as an international security problem. Many identified groups of these ignorant people were found to be linked to Pakistan. Proper education of these ignorant people was presented as a remedy to secure the international. And so the US government, with the help of US aid, sent tens of millions of dollars for education sector reform in Pakistan. In September 2009, US Congress authorized $1.5 billion a year for the next 5 years for the development of modern nationwide school curriculums and for the oversight of all educational institutions, including religious schools in Pakistan. Education was seen as a means to counter or prevent violent extremism that threatened world security. I examined international policy discourse on preventing violent extremism through the theoretical construct white ignorance. And I use Robert Koch's ideas, who argues that, basically my argument is that preventing violent extremism policies, they choose to remain ignorant of the problems of the prevailing social, political, and epistemic status quo. Cox basically divides the theories into two categories. One is the problem-solving theories, and the other is the critical theories. So, and they say that problem-solving theories, they try to resolve the problem within a given status quo. But the critical theories, they try to engage with the problems of the status quo. They do not exclude the status quo from analysis. So what I argue is that most of the prevent violent extremism policies, they remain in the problem-solving framework, and they avoid discussing the problems of the status quo and how they contribute to the problem, to the making of the problem of violent extremism. I maintain that this deliberate ignorance renders current prevent violent extremism policies ineffective and counterproductive. So when we are excluding the problems of the status quo from the analysis, that's a huge gap, and because of which there's a problem in the policies, and the policies are not effective on the ground, and they remain, in fact, counterproductive many times. So let me first explain the construct white ignorance. White ignorance is described by Charles Mills as an ignorance in which race, white racism, or white racial domination and their ramification plays a crucial causal role. White ignorance includes the denial of white privilege in the prevailing status quo and the refusal to acknowledge the long history of structural discrimination that has left whites with differential resources they have today. Mueller explains that contrary to popular perception, ignorance is an actively constructed social product. It is not a passive byproduct. Mueller proposes a theory of racial ignorance that describes how and why racial ignorance is produced, as well as when, where, and by whom. The theory explains white people's militant commitment to an epistemology of ignorance, a way of knowing oriented towards evading, mystifying, and obscuring the reality of racism, and to produce misunderstandings useful for domination. Using the construct white ignorance, I examine UNESCO's policy guide on preventing violent extremism, through education. Now, this is a policy document which is available online. If you Google it, you can find out. And this actually represents a much wider discourse on security and many efforts in different parts of the world. You have a very sustained effort in Europe. Britain came up with a policy of prevent, and they were actually engaging the educational institutions, the schools and teachers, and asking them to identify learners at risk, students who may be vulnerable, who can be drawn towards violent extremism. So there is this very consistent campaign for quite some time, for many years in Europe, in different parts of Europe, in Australia, and some of the other countries there, they think that they should engage education to prevent violent extremism because it relates to the ideas of people, and schools and teachers can play a role in detecting violent extremism before it becomes a problem. So there's this wider security discourse which has been in place since at least still 2010 onwards. 2011, we had the prevent policy in Britain, which has been criticized on many grounds, but still that line of thinking is there, especially in the security domain. So this UN policy document represents a wider security discourse on the subject. The document is available online, so one can see it if you want to. So my aim is that I utilize the construct white ignorance to unmask the innate racism of white strategies to rescue the world from the menace of the brown bodies. The UN policy guide largely presents the following thesis. So this is the basic thesis which they present to counter violent extremism or to prevent violent extremism. The idea is the violent extremism is an individual's problem, and that individual needs to be educated to prevent the problem. So the UN document highlights the role of education in preventing violent extremism, but it ignores the role of education in preventing violence, which is broadly understood as inclusive of both direct and structural violence. There is very little reference to structural violence in the UN document. Drawing from Muller's theory of racial ignorance, I examine how ignorance is actively produced in the UN document through constructing mythical abstractions, emphasizing what suits the status quo, and evading what challenges the status quo. So these are the three themes which I identify in the document, and this is how ignorance is actively produced in this UN policy document. So mythical abstractions, they help conceal reality, and hence they serve as a convenient medium to shape the dominant discourses. Muller asserts that powerful groups make a unique, rational investment in not understanding the prevailing power dynamics because understanding may lead to discomfort. Defining the term violent extremism with clarity and understanding its broader dynamics remains a challenge for the UN policy document. And this remains a challenge for the wider security discourse as well. There has not been a consensus on the definition of these main terms of the phenomena we are fighting, of the phenomena we are trying to counter. That phenomena is not clear. And the UN document clearly, explicitly states that the problem of definition is not solved. So the document intends to prevent violent extremism through education without fully understanding what it means. Since, I quote from the document, choosing to do nothing until the debate on the meaning of the term is resolved is not an option. So this is what they're saying in the document. They don't fully understand what it means, but choosing to do nothing is not an option. The document refers to terminological complexities involved in defining the concept. This is on the very first page. They talk about the terminological complexities around the concepts of violent extremism, as these are, according to them, complex and largely debated phenomena. That's right. So what they suggest is they adopt a practical approach, which is taken by UN General Assembly, which consists in not seeking to provide a definition of these terms. This is the practical approach, not seeking to provide a definition of these terms. Are we trying to avoid something here? And we are not, we are just okay with not defining what we are fighting or what we are trying to undo. However, to provide us some insights into the subject, this is the second page or the next pages. One definition of violent extremism has been offered. This is for the practical purposes. They say violent extremism is the beliefs and actions of people who support or use violence to achieve ideological, religious, or political goals. So we have one definition provided there. And basically they say the people, the beliefs and actions of people who support or use violence. Now, violence is one word which has been used quite often, but what violence is, that has not been sufficiently described and explained. And the term violence is not defined, despite the fact that ample conceptualization of the term is available in peace studies literature. Peace studies literature views violence as inclusive of both direct and structural violence. However, UN document restricts violence to direct violence only. Now, this is about the definition of the problem, which is the central problem of the document. Now, the central, the strategy of the document is how education can prevent violent extremism. So how education can be used to prevent violent extremism is a greater mystery, which is meticulously preserved in the UN document. I tried to understand it as a teacher, as someone who's been involved in education for quite some time. I could not really understand how they intend to use education to counter violent extremism. Using Koch's words, the document solves the problem of violent extremism through education within the framework of the prevailing order. So they actively avoid discussing the problems of the prevailing order. The document evades problematizing the prevailing order. This particular evasion leads to multiple explicit and implicit ambiguities and complexities in the draft. Since they're trying to avoid discussing status quo as a problem, there are a number of ambiguities which you find in the document. You have selective emphases. You have some things are emphasized a lot, and then there are other things which are avoided. So let us examine what is emphasized in the document to prevent violent extremism. These are the functions of education which have been emphasized, which according to the document can prevent whatever they call violent extremism. Number one is promoting inclusion and respect for human diversity. This has been repeated quite often. Inclusion and diversity, page 10, page 23, 29, 60. Then they talk about fostering resilience in students, fostering resilience in the young minds, 11, page 11, 12, 20, 32. Providing employment, education's role in providing careers and employment and financial security, that has been described as one of the functions of education which can reduce violent extremism. And I'm not saying that they don't have, this function of education is not useful, but there are things which are emphasized which do not necessarily threaten the status quo, and then there are things which are avoided, which are a very big part of the problem. Then you have promoting global citizenship and human rights awareness. This has been repeated quite often as well. Actually, the UN is offering a global citizenship program as well, and monitoring disengagement, rehabilitation, and reintegration programs. So basically, these are the functions of education which are described as the functions which are going to counter violent extremism. All of the above functions of education ensure the stability of status quo, and they seek to minimize disruptions in the prevailing state of affairs. So Muller points out that the dominant white groups tend to support diversity and inclusion as long as they believe they will reap the benefits of a diverse learning environment. Diversity is promoted when it does not disrupt white hegemony. Inclusion is encouraged as long as the centrality of the white position is maintained. So as long as the white privilege or white hegemony or the white, they remain at the center, it's all right if people are included in that center or people There are diverse people who are informing that as long as that centrality is not challenged, inclusion and diversity, it suits the status quo. It informs the status quo. So the term resilience is also emphasized in the UN draft. Resilience aims to build an individual's capacity to withstand the disruptive challenges. It emphasizes individuals' responsibility to protect themselves against the odds. Individuals' responsibility to protect themselves. It does not encourage collective political action against the odds. So resilience is again your responsibility to protect yourself against whatever is there. It's not to change what is there. So let us now see the evasions in the draft, things which have not been discussed, although they were very much relevant to the problem and to the education as well. So I'm going to talk about the ignored meanings, the contradictory meanings, the restricted meanings, color blindness, and colonial blindness in this draft. I first point out the ignored meanings in the draft. The term violence in educational settings has been explained in the document as acts such as corporal and psychological punishment, bullying, sexual and gender-based violence, which is practiced in higher education institutions. So they define violence as acts, the acts of direct violence. And again, Johan Galtung, it's a very well-known definition of violence, which is the basis of peace studies as well. Galtung describes violence. He says that violence is present when human beings are being influenced so that their actual somatic and mental realizations are below their potential realizations. So anything that stops human beings from achieving their full potential is violence, according to Galtung. Now, this particular definition is very much relevant to educational settings and education. And the document is about how education can prevent violent extremism, but UN policy draft chooses to ignore this well-known definition of violence. It restricts the meaning of violence to direct violence only. Then you have the contradictory. Again, you have restrictive meanings and contradictory meanings. The term critical thinking has been used in the draft multiple times in somewhat contradictory sense. At one point, critical thinking is associated with the ability to understand a multiplicity of views. At another point, it has been associated with resilience and inquiry-based learning. However, in social sciences, it's generally critical thinking refers to a way of thinking that questions the normal mainstream world and challenges the status quo. But the draft ignores this particular meaning of the term, this most widely used and understood meaning of the term. Moreover, the draft recommends critical thinking alongside contradictory terms like mainstreaming curriculum content and reintegration to normal. Thus, it obscures the meaning of the term critical thinking. So, although I think critical thinking is one of the most important functions of education, which can be used to prevent violent extremism. As a teacher, through my experience, I know this really empowers students, but it has not been used in that sense of giving the sense of empowerment to the student and making them question the status quo and everything. That is not described in the draft. Then you have restricted meanings. Wherever structural factors are mentioned in the draft, so they are as drivers of violent extremism, they are mentioned in the local context only. The issues of governance, human rights, marginalization, discrimination, socioeconomic disparity, prolonged conflicts, they are discussed, somewhere they are discussed, but they are discussed as problems of the local or regional context. The global structures of oppression, racism, coloniality, capitalist exploitation, inequality, injustice are ignored in the draft. Then you have color blindness and colonial blindness in the draft as well. Color blindness stands for the refusal to see systemic racism of contemporary times. UN policy draft takes extra care to avoid any indication of racial bias against Muslims or other communities while describing challenges in identifying learners at risk. Now, they do ask teachers and schools to identify learners, identify students who are vulnerable, who can be drawn towards extremist ideas. And when they do that, they are careful. The UN document itself, it is careful that it is not associating violent extremism with any particular group, with Muslims. But in practice, what it recommends is French Ministry of Education's booklet for understanding how to detect warning signs in classrooms and report cases. So what they recommend in practice and what they cite in practice is the French Ministry of Education's booklet. Now this booklet, the French National Plan to Prevent Radicalization, it explicitly associates radicalization with Muslims. And it's very clear on that. And charting, it charts plans to deal with the changing nature of the Islamist threat. So they are using the word Islamist. They are associating the radicalization with Muslims and particular communities. And that is what the UN policy document recommends. So you have these racial undertones which are there. When you're trying to identify learners at risk, and you're particularly associating that with certain communities, with Muslims who may be vulnerable to be drawn towards violent extremism, it becomes a problem. And UK's prevent policy, it has been criticized on this ground. And even the teachers, they have protested. Then you have the colonial blindness as well. Colonial blindness is a play on the concept of color blindness that points towards colonial non-knowing. For intercultural dialogue and to deepen students' knowledge of cultural diversity, UN policy recommends programs on heritage and creativity and collaboration with museums and cultural centers. This is what is recommended by the draft, that there should be programs, educational programs on heritage and creativity. There should be collaboration with museums and cultural centers so that the students, they get to know about other cultures, they are exposed to other cultures, and they are aware of the other cultures. But how such colonial blind awareness of the other cultures, not knowing their oppressive histories and subjugated present, may prevent violent extremism has not been clarified in the draft. So having just going to the museum, having a nice time there, or looking at the other cultures without understanding them deeply, without engaging with their histories, without engaging with their oppressive past, how is that kind of understanding, how is that going to prevent violent extremism? I did not understand the connection there. So, and then there are other evasions in the draft as well. There are other key omissions. The draft completely ignores the multiple forms of epistemic injustice and academic dependency in the contemporary world. The draft talks about education, educational settings, but it completely ignores the structures of education which are unjust in the world. It ignores how global education structures dominated by the white suppress the voices of the others. It forgets how the others remain completely dependent on the white knowledge and publication enterprise to be able to contribute to the knowledge domain. These are not the things, these are not the concerns of the draft. So when I gaze back, I see a different view, a broader, deeper, and clearer view of the problem under discussion. I see that more than the resentful ignorance of the poor and the impoverished, it is the comfortable white ignorance of the powerful and the privileged that puts the world's security in danger. So to secure the world, the powerful and the privileged need to be educated, and the white ignorance has to be countered. So how does one counter a deliberate ignorance, so an intentional ignorance? How can one counter that? And theory of racial ignorance, it emphasizes the importance of everyday ideological struggles. It advocates revolutions of the everyday. So every day in our own way, making visible the invisible facts of domination is one way of undoing white ignorance. The UN PVE, Preventing Violent Extremism Policy Guideline, undoing white ignorance entails demystifying. So when I'm referring to this particular policy document, undoing white ignorance would mean that we are trying to demystify the terminology which is used. We have to clearly define what the problem is. We do not have to avoid anything. We don't have to avoid the problems of the status quo while we are discussing the problem. And we have to fully understand the problem we are trying to counter. So educating white security policies involve fully understanding issues that need to be addressed through engagement with history and inclusion of multiple perspectives in policy making. It means empowering local voices in a given context and allowing the local people the freedom to identify and correct white ignorance in the policies made about them. So if you're trying to prevent violent extremism in Pakistan, if you're trying to prevent violent extremism in other parts of the world, you should at least try to engage with the voices of the people there, try to understand their perspectives, and those people should have the freedom to correct white ignorance and to really inform security policies if we are serious about securing the world. So moreover, broadening the scope of education and training given to decision makers, policymakers, leaders around the world to include critical, radical, decolonial perspectives that challenge everyday whiteness may lead to formulations of more informed security policies. So especially in the security policy domain, if we can engage leaders, and there are trainings and educational programs for policymakers as well, maybe it's about time that we inform the policy making process through critical perspectives as well. So what I'm proposing is a critically informed policy making in the field of international security. That's about it. And I think I would be really happy to receive comments and questions and Professor Alatas' comments.
So should I just go ahead?
Yes, please do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Sajjad. I agree with your approach, and I think it's very needed. It's hard hitting, it's critical, and of course it's decolonial. But I think we need to specify how it's decolonial, why it's decolonial, and what are some of the main issues. Some of the main issues that I would like to raise around your paper. So the way I understand it is that your work is decolonial for at least two reasons. One is that you point to the global structures of inequality, as opposed to what the documents you're looking at point to, namely regional or local structures. When they do, as you said, when they do talk about structures, it's mainly regional or local structures. And also they tend to be individualist rather than structuralist in their approach. So you are saying that there is some ignorance, some neglect of the global structures of inequality, and to the extent that the global structures of inequality are due to the legacy of colonialism, are due to the hegemony of the US and so on and so forth. The critique of this, of course, is a decolonial one. So that point, I think, is well taken. The other aspect of your paper, which is decolonial, is your discussion on the role of ignorance, a role of a very productive kind of ignorance. So I think this is all very clear, why your work is decolonial. So my comments would be more along the lines of how your arguments can be strengthened. And I have, I think, seven points to make, which I'll try to make very, very quickly. The first one is that you, in your critique of the dominant discourse, sometimes you refer to distortions in the dominant discourse, distortions relating to Islam, for example, or to Muslims. Sometimes you refer to generalization, that they tend to generalize. Sometimes you say that, you know, erroneous things are being said, and sometimes you say that incomplete accounts are given. Now, I think I would agree that actually both are happening. You know, sometimes you have distortions of Islam, sometimes you have not so much distortions, but generalizations. Sometimes points that they make about Muslims are correct, or about Islam are correct, but they are taken out of context. But I think all these things need to be distinguished. The one has to be distinguished from the other. And it might be useful if you actually gave examples of where distortions are being made, as opposed to where, you know, the particular is generalized to, you know, to give the impression that something that is specific to a particular Muslim community, that may be true, is a characteristic of the whole Muslim world. So that distinction, those distinctions should be made clear in your paper. My other point, and maybe this is a little bit more critical, and I think it's good, you know, for us to have a discussion on this. When you talk about ignorance, I agree with the problem of ignorance. It's just that I'm not sure whether the way you define ignorance is any different from what has been previously defined as Orientalism. Because you do seem to be talking about, when you talk about ignorance, you do seem to be talking about a productive kind of ignorance, which in which a particular construction of Islam or Muslims, in your case, is the result, and of which a particular kind of construction of Islam is the result, and it functions to maintain the status quo, to further the interests of those who are feigning such ignorance, or who are producing such ignorance. Now that sounds to me like it's Orientalist ideology. Now, if the notion of ignorance is actually different, then you need to be clear about how it is a different concept from ideology. How does it add to our discussion on this problem? How does it? Where does it take us? Does it take us to a place where applying the concept of ideology does not take us? You know, so what value added is there from talking about ignorance rather than ideology, or rather than Orientalism as ideology? So that's the second point. The third point, which you mentioned very briefly, the role of structural factors, and you know, that how the UNPVE document talks about context, but that is narrowly defined, but I feel that, you know, there isn't enough discussion. Not that you need to discuss it here, but you at least need to mention that a problem, a central problem in all of this has to do with the role of the US. This definitely has to be mentioned. I mean, when we talk about structural factors, we're not talking about structural factors in the abstract, right? In the real world, these structural factors have a lot to do with the role of, well, you know, in the past it was, of course, especially in the context of Pakistan and Afghanistan. In the past, the Soviet Union had a strong role to play, and the Cold War, which explains the rise of the Mujahideen and the rise later on of the Taliban, and many of the problems that we face till today in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. So the powers, Soviet Union before, today the US, to some extent NATO, some of the European nations, I think are very important as central problems in this structural explanation, as opposed to an individualist or psychological or culturalist explanation. So I think, not that you need to spend more time discussing the US, but I think it has at least to be, the point has to be stated that that this is, a central problem. Now, I'm interested in the, in the end, you talk about radical alternatives. You said the possibility of radical alternatives, and I think that needs to be, and I'd like to take that up more seriously. I can think of at least 3 ways in which your approach could be radical. It can be, critical, more critical than it is now. The first is that when you talk about violent extremism, I think it's useful to make the distinction between, however you define extremism, it's useful to make to make a distinction between. You see, usually the distinction is made between physical violent extremism and non-violent extremism. But I think it's more useful to make the distinction between physically violent extremism and non-physically violent extremism. So any form of extremism, that does not result in physical violence, but is characterized by hate speech, for example, or is characterized by misogyny, is a form of violence. And in fact, you did refer to, for example, to psychological violence, but I think that should probably come out more clearly in the paper. Secondly, I think you are perfectly correct to highlight the problems of white ignorance, and to then cast doubt on the the solution that they suggest in terms of education and so on. But at the same time, and you have said that you agree that education is necessary, but the problem is contextualization, generalization, and so on. But at the same time, we have to also admit to ourselves that there is the problem of internal traditionalist orientations. That the problem is not just white ignorance, is not just Orientalism, it's also our own internal ideological problems that predate colonialism, that predate the influence of the West, that predate modernity. And these problems in our legacy, in our tradition, continue to haunt us. Now, of course, I mean, I've spoken about this before, sectarianism, anti-Shiite hate speech. Now, of course, we can all agree that sectarian differences are taken advantage of by the powers that be. There is evidence that the US was involved took advantage of sectarianism in the case of Syria and possibly Iraq. So we know we know. But the problem of sectarianism predates colonialism. It predates modernity. We have had a serious problem of sectarianism in our society. In the modern period, when you have US hegemony, that sectarianism can then be taken advantage of, right? But we need to have a discourse among ourselves that is critical of these internal ideological problems. Again, I'm not saying that in a paper like this you need to focus on traditionalism, for example, sectarian thought or sectarian ideology. You don't need to do that, but it at least needs to be footnoted that you consider these as serious problems, so that you avoid the possible criticism that you are being one-sided, that you are attributing all the problems to external factors, to Eurocentrism, to Orientalism, to white ignorance. In other words, you're being apologist, apologetic, and I know you're not. But there are many who make similar arguments as you do, and they are being apologetic, that the problem is really the West, and our ideology, our religion is being misunderstood. There are many people who say that, but we know that we are sectarian, we are misogynist. There's a long tradition of misogynist thinking among Muslim scholars. So we just need to to admit that and deal with those internal problems, even while we are dealing with the external problems, which you are talking about as white ignorance. My third suggestion in terms of being radical, I think, is, since you are not discounting the importance of education, what are the sources within the legacy, within our legacy, or within within at least within the Pakistan, the legacy of Pakistan, the tradition that you are heir to. What are the intellectual resources? And I'm, of course, thinking of Iqbal, of Basharat Ali, of Fazlur Rahman, and other thinkers and scholars. What are the intellectual resources, and how can they be translated into education, into education policy, but more importantly, into a philosophy of education? How can these resources, and what are the progressive resources that you have, intellectual resources that you have, which can be translated into a philosophy of education that deals with both the external problem of white ignorance and the kind of policies at the international level that they generate, as well as dealing with the internal, ideological problems that we have, within the Muslim tradition. So I think those are some of the issues that you could, maybe incorporate into your paper to perhaps make it more radical. I think you're thinking, you don't think this way, but many people do, that it is West versus East, or the West versus Islam or the Muslim world. I think to avoid that, one has to emphasize that it is about progress versus regress, about progressive ideas versus regressive ideas. And we all know that the regressive hegemonic ideas, the parochial ideas associated with Orientalism and white ignorance are problems, but we also have equally regressive parochial ideas within our own communities, represented in our governments, in our ministries of education, and so on. And I think the distinction, so always emphasize, Islamic tradition, but more in the modern period by scholars like Ali Shariati, about haq and batil, about truth and falsehood. And clearly, the divide between truth and falsehood is not a West-East divide, right? And again, I know you are not thinking in this dichotomous or binary way, but these things also need to be emphasized to those who might use a paper like yours to, strengthen their orientation that the problem lies, all in the West. I think, this is what I have to, to say for now, and perhaps we can bring out some more issues in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Alatas. I think some of the things you pointed out, they're very, very important, and especially this the need to avoid the reverse Orientalism or the paper taken in the wrong sense, because that problem is there. And you're absolutely right that in our own context, there's so many problems. And
but so Dr. Sajjad, I just want to emphasize that I certainly know that you do not think that way at all, you know, and it's not implied in your paper. But if you don't make some strong points against it, your paper can be, the evidence and the arguments can be used by others, you know?
Yes, I know exactly, and this is the reason I agree, because this is how sometimes my paper is taken that way. Sometimes it does happen. So I've seen that kind of interpretation. So I completely agree. I need to be very clear that we are not thinking in the binary terms, because a lot of people in our own context, when they're doing resistance, that is, we have that binary which is there. So I completely share that concern. Thank you so much. And I've noted down all the other things as well. Especially, particularly one thing you told about US, I think if I can share my screen again. Yes, I was, just a second. Okay, it's very interesting. The point I was making about this is coming from a US think tank. Bruce Riedel is writing that Pakistan is the most dangerous country in the world. And all of the nightmares, and the nightmares he lists: the nuclear proliferation, drug smuggling, military dictatorship, and international terrorism. All of these, they are the contributions. It could not be possible in Pakistan without the US contributions to all these problems, the dictatorships, the international terrorism, and everything. So I think that point is also well taken. What you're pointing out, that US has a huge contribution to all these problems. But at the same time, yes, I think the radical change has to start from ourselves. And I completely agree with you there that the problems we have with our mindsets, that has to be tackled first. Thank you so much for this. I've noted down all these things, and I'm going to review it again, and I'll try. Some of this I am trying to do in my current work. Some of this I have tackled in some other work, but thank you for all this listing all these things. I have it in front of me, so I'm going to definitely go through it again. So if you have further questions, please go ahead.
While people are thinking, can I also just add, on this last point about Pakistan and nuclear proliferation, right? While, I mean, regardless of what we may think, we may have different views about whether it is legitimate or ethically, permissible to have nuclear weapons. I think when you talk about fears about Pakistan having nuclear weapons, it's also very educational for you to point out to your readers that the only country to have, the only current colonial country has nuclear weapons, and that's Israel, right? That's one point, right? Pakistan has not colonized other countries. Iran, which they claim is trying to build nuclear weapons, has always been the victim of aggression for centuries. Actually, it's not trying to colonize any country. It is Israel, which has basically, which is a colonial settler state. Again, useful at least in a footnote to mention this. And then the only country to have used nuclear weapons, the atomic bomb, is the United States.
Yes.
In a very, most barbaric action. And not, they used it against a community, a society, which they probably felt, they didn't use it against the Germans, right? And I think there was a racist element there, that even though they went to war with the Germans, they could not use it in Europe because they are the same people. But they had no problems, using it against the Japanese. And until today, there's no apology from the United States.
Yes.
Other countries are expected, other communities, a society are expected, the Japanese are expected to apologize for the comfort women, for the forced prostitution in Southeast Asia. And other societies, and the church is expected to apologize, the Catholic Church, for some of the atrocities concerning the Holocaust, for example, the conduct. But there's no, so we have this kind of standard. So again, it's not it's not that you need to discuss all these things at length, but I think when you bring up certain issues, it will be very educational for your readers that you at least mention them, briefly, perhaps in a footnote, so that people have some perspective, that all this fear created about Pakistan and about Iran having nuclear weapons, shouldn't we really fear the US, because they have used it and they had no qualms about using it?
Yes, and not once, but twice. So this is one thing I tried to briefly mention in the paper. I do say that there were 2 planes in 1945 who demolished 2 cities, but that is framed in the security discourses as they were trying to do it to ensure world security. So that kind of, yes, the double standards, they're very much visible, and you're perfectly right that we have to point them out so that we can make the links with empirical world. Thank you so much, Professor Alatas. Carolyn, would you like to say something?
Not really. I'm just like being an audience here, but I do think the Western intellectuals should learn to take criticism without being defensive all the time and bickering about every detail. So for me, the paper is perfectly okay, and I think for me, I think it should and can be formulated like that. I also see Professor Alatas' point that some people might be defensive and start tearing the paper down, unfortunately. So yeah, it's my job and other white people's job to stop being like defensive and tearing down other people's critiques that are very well justified. So yeah, but yeah, I'm just listening here, so never mind me.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any question in the chat box? Maybe someone, if you have any question, maybe you can write it in the chat box as well. Okay, if you do not have a question, yes, please, Professor Alatas, I was going to request you if you would like to add something.
Yeah, no, I have a lot of things to to say, actually, because I'm thinking in terms of not only the issues that you are raising, the substantive issues concerning Islam, concerning Pakistan, and so on, but I'm also interested in the larger issue of how this type of discourse provides, how your paper provides a better understanding of what is wrong with with Eurocentric or Orientalist discourse, right? In other words, somebody who knows nothing or has no interest in Pakistan, how will they gain from reading your paper? And I think an interesting way to contextualize what you are talking about, in fact, you've done a little bit of it. You're talking about peace studies, right? And of course you're citing a more critical scholar in peace studies, Johan Galtung. But I think what would be interesting is if somewhere in the paper, maybe it could be by way of conclusion, but a lengthy conclusion, is you make the distinction between the dominant international relations framework, which tends to be very conservative, very pro status quo, and how the UN discourse fits within that, And then you have perspectives that are critical of that. And I can think of at least two. You have the kind of critical international relations theory associated with what's his name, Barry Buzan and Amitabh Acharya. And then you've got the kind of critical peace studies. So actually, I suppose what I'm talking about is your theoretical framework. And maybe this is what you need to do, is to think about a theoretical framework that sort of combines critical peace studies and critical IR.
Okay.
And some of that, of course, also Ramon Grossfogel and De Sousa
and Vignolo and all those people. Yes.
Yeah, but they, I think they don't have it's not their intention, so they don't have they've not articulated an international relations kind of theory, right? It's not their intention to do that. It's sort of there, but it's it's more in the abstract. But I think the two people that have actually done it, Barry Buzan and Amitabh Acharya. But I think it's interesting to to look at Buzan and Acharya and see how you can bring in Grossfogel, how you can bring in Galtung together as you think about Pakistan.
Yes, yes. Actually, that's what I do a lot. Actually, the critique of the mainstream international relations theory is what I really like doing generally in my classes and all that. And I completely understand and completely agree that I can put all this in a broader framework of my discipline, and that would be useful. Thank you so much.